I was born in Ladysmith, Wisconsin. I was brought here as an infant. My father moved here. He was a dairy farmer in Wisconsin. Came out to California after the war. We were part of the migration from the World War II to California, okay? A lot of you folks may or may not be of that same, but when we moved here in the valley, there were the permanent people that had been here for generations, and that was pretty much, you had basically your Catholic folks and you had your Mormon folks, and that was what the high desert was pretty much made up of prior to World War II. After the war, we built, during the war, of course, the air base was built, which was an army base at that point, and that brought a lot of folks in. And that started bringing in, and we also learned during the war that we had a lot of minerals in the desert, and we started a lot of mining. There was already a lot of ranching here, but that brought a lot of mining in. So that brought a lot of workers in to work the different mines, and in those days there were hundreds of mines instead of just several like we have today. So that brought a lot of folks in. My dad came to this valley, and because of that, I think it gave me a different perspective of looking at how we ranch and what we do differently than what most ranchers do. And if I were to condemn most ranchers, that when the ranches are passed down from generation to generation, a lot of times, when you ask a rancher why he does something, his answer is, because my dad did it, my grandfather did it, so I'm doing it. Right or wrong, that's the way we do it, okay? And so I was able to sit back because I didn't inherit a ranch. I was able and had to sit back and make sure that it was, number one, was financially sustainable, okay? I had to make sure that I didn't have a reserve of money, a capital to work off of if I was doing something wrong. So we had to make sure it was financially sustainable. The other thing that happened to me, because I didn't have a big bankroll, I had to try to figure out everything that you do in management costs a lot of money. So you were able to sit down and say, if I'm going to plant these seeds, if I'm going to go in and I'm going to manage this particular piece of ground, and I'm going to plant seeds and I'm going to do those things, am I going to get a return for that or not? And I soon realized that oftentimes you don't get a return for that. We do it because why? Dad did it, so I'm doing it. Grandpa did it, so I'm doing it. Not because it's necessarily the right thing to do financially or environmentally, okay? So we take a look at what we have, and what it taught me to work off of is a circle of life, okay? So the first thing that I learned to do is start looking at what happens every year if we don't touch it. If we don't touch something, what happens every year? And where I really got to start learning this is when you guys go out to the East Mojave, and you're gonna be meeting Mr. Blair when you go out to that. And he's one that his family and a lot of those folks that were ranchers out there, they had to live within the circle of life in order to make it, because they're not gonna plant, they're not gonna plow, they're not gonna irrigate, they're not gonna do those things. So I started taking my small projects and doing the same thing and was successful with it. So today we have our own brand, our own label, meat label. It's a grass-fed label. Most of our product is sold in the San Diego area. And so we were able to do that probably because I didn't inherit a ranch and I changed up things that we're doing. So the ranch that I operate here in the high desert is the Lost Forest Ranch. If any of you have ever been to Lake Silverwood, you've went and by the property where the big white fence is all along it. You look out there and you see the fields. We don't till an inch of soil. We don't plant a seed. We don't use any fertilizers, and we use no herbicides, and we do not pump 1 gallon of water. We only use the water that's given to us, okay? The water we receive is either by rain, and we receive 2 million gallons of water a day from the city of Crestline, affluent water. That water comes to us in a form that is, some countries would drink it. We wouldn't allow it to be drank in our country, but it meets and exceeds most national or most international drinking water standards when it comes to us. But it has a lot of nitrates in it. So the water that passes through that ranch is the same water that when you go over here and you draw out a glass of water will be the same glass of water. That is the headwaters for our aquifer. And you guys will see that when you come out and visit the ranch, okay? That's our headwaters, and our water flows from the mountain range all the way out through the Mojave. So when you get all the way out at Mr. Blair's ranch and you use the water, it's the water that came from my ranch, okay? And other rain runoff and whatever, but that's the headwaters where it all starts. On that particular property, we have the Cedar Springs Creek, and we have the Horse Thief Creek, and we have the Grass Valley Creek. All three of those creeks run into one creek, which is called the West Fork of the Mojave River, okay? And then you have the West Fork and the East Fork that makes the Mojave River. So we are the headwaters, and we have a lot of water that runs through that ranch. We have been able to prove that the water is cleaner when it leaves than when it gets there. So we're actually cleaning the water, okay? So if we want to talk about grazing, the benefits to grazing, there are a number of benefits. And those benefits range from cleaning the water, okay? If we do it properly, we can clean the water. If we've grazed on rangeland properly, the water should be cleaner when it leaves the property than when it gets there. And people go, well, how can that be? You got cows pooping in the water. You got cows pooping all over the place. So we'll break it down very simply. Because I don't bring any other feeds in, I don't bring any fertilizer in, I don't bring any herbicides in. All we have is the matter that grows there, okay? The plants that grow. When they go harvest those plants, the only thing that's going to break those plants down is bacteria. So we use a ruminant stomach to break that down. It's using bacteria again to break it down. So we're not changing anything. All we're doing is using bacteria to break it down, to pull some of the energy, the sugars, and different nutritional parts of the plant out of it. When it extrudes its waste, there is less energy in that than there was the grass it ate. There's less for the bacteria to grow on. So it actually produces less bacteria than if the grass had fallen on top of one another and it matted down and the bacteria had grown, because that's what's got to eat up the grass is the bacteria, okay? So it would have been all of that energy, and all of that would have went into the water. So it's less by the animals taking some of the energy out. We get the benefit by that by having a very healthy product, a very good grass-fed product, okay? It's important in order for this to work that you don't bring other things in. So you can't be bringing, you got to graze properly so that you're not bringing feed in during the winter. You have to manage your grass so that your animals can make it through the non-growing season as well. On the Lost Forest Ranch, that requires some management, not as much as it would require in other places, such as our Central Coast, and I have a ranch there as well. It requires a lot more management because we have a much shorter window of rain and a much shorter growing season. We have a much longer growing season on this particular ranch because we have meadows, we have river bottom, and we have high desert all on the same ranch. So we have a much larger growing period. The other thing that is a benefit by grazing is the social benefits that we get out of it, okay? And part of that is producing a product that is healthy, okay? And just this weekend, I was at one of the Hearst Corporation ranches that is doing a grass-fed project, and it's called the Jack Ranch, and it's up on the Central Coast, and it's 40,000 acres, and they provide all the meat for Whole Foods for a 90-day portion of the year, 1/4 of the year. They're one of 4 ranches that do that. Okay, they're large enough to do that. You know, and the interesting thing that along with how they treat their land and what they do, and it makes all of us think greener, and it makes all of us think about different things. But the one thing that I found interesting is they're constantly looking how they can produce this product cheaper. Why cheaper? We know the cheaper we produce it, the wider the use can be. Okay? Right now, most of the folks that's going to enjoy grass-fed beef in society are going to be middle class and up. Okay? It's not readily available for Head Start programs. Maybe where it should be used the most, it's not getting to. All right? So one of the concerns I thought was rather unique is here's a very large corporation already thinking about how can we cheapen this up so that we can have one day get it into a school program, get it into some type of program like that. I thought that was pretty neat that they're thinking. It's not that it's there, but at least they're thinking about that and talking about that and discussing that. So the social benefits are huge that happens. We all know today that the healthier we can eat, and we believe that grass-fed beef is healthier than other. And meat's not going to go nowhere. You know, we can talk about, you know, all we want to that we're going to someday evolve into a society that's not going to use meat. That's never going to happen. You know, what humans consume, that circle will become larger, not smaller. Okay? Our new law with marijuana has just proven that. Okay? What we consume legally will grow, not shrink. Okay? So that's something socially that every farmer has to understand, that something that we may not be growing today, we will be growing tomorrow. And so we're always looking at that. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when I was at a rancher's meeting that we had, a High Desert Cattlemen's Association, and one of the gentlemen, he's still alive today, he said, you know, I don't know why we can't start a grass-fed program with these cattle leaving the desert. This is the most natural beef in the world. He was only about 30 years ahead of his time. You know, so our circle of what people eat are getting larger, not smaller. It's something we all have to understand. As folks begin to get more educated and understand things, or we begin to understand the human body better, we understand we want a larger abilities, what we eat, what we use, not smaller. So meat's not going nowhere. It's part of our heritage. It's certainly part of America's heritage. It's most every country's heritage that some form of meat is eaten. It's part of where we all come from, okay? So it's not going anywhere. It's always going to be a staple of our protein. Now, how we can do that within our society with the least footprint, and how we can then even do it where it benefits society, boy, now we've really moved that into the right direction. And so grazing is important in that. So when you look at a piece of ground that's not being grazed, you look at something, and I often say it would be like if we took all of these reusable containers and made sure they all went to the landfill and was never used. It's a renewable resource that we should be using. So when you go somewhere in the mountains, or you go somewhere and you see this grass that grows a couple of 100 acres or a couple of 1,000 acres and nobody's using it, we're probably not doing the right thing, okay? History will prove that we went through the last part of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century very ignorant about not using our resources properly. Now, grazing, naturally you got to have the right species on it, okay? Because we know there's different things to graze for different reasons, different times, and so species is very important. Probably the one species that does the most damage and does the least amount of good for anybody is the solid hoofed species, okay? Which is known as the wild horse or the wild donkey, okay? And history will prove that. We're already beginning to see that they absolutely do more damage to our land than anything else. Why is that? We look at it as a wild horse and a wild donkey, but we forget that they weren't here until the Spaniards came here, till the first white men came here. We brought them. We still insist they're here on our land for some reason. I love to see them. There's nothing I enjoy more going out and looking at them, but there's a big cost that we're paying. Our society is paying for that pristine pictures of those wild animals being out there, and they're really not wild. They're domestic that have went rogue. So that's something we it doesn't matter how you look at that particular argument. Those are the facts that we have to deal with, and how you guys are going to deal with them. My time of dealing with it is basically over. It's now you guys' turn to deal with that. It's going to be exciting for you guys to see how you do things different than we did things, because you have a lot more information to work with, today. Two, I think that most young people care more today than they did in my generation. Okay? I think they care more. And when I say that, it's not that people didn't care in my generation. They didn't care enough to roll up their sleeves and do the hard work of finding and getting the proper information. And what I see most with most young people today is they're willing to work hard for that information, get the right information, and let science prevail. And do the right things for the right reasons, not let their political views, whether they're a meat eater or not a meat eater, whether they're for wild horses, not for wild horses, whether they're for this or for that. You guys are more apt to allow science to prevail. In my generation, we had a warm and fuzzy feeling, and if it didn't fit the warm and fuzzy category, it didn't make it, okay? And so it appears to me that you guys are a lot more, maybe you could say cold-hearted, but you let the facts speak. And I think you do that because you understand the population is such that if you don't do that, there isn't gonna be anything for anybody, you know? And those are the facts of the matter. You know, one of the other benefits is of course, having grazing happening on rangeland is the illegal use of the land. When you don't have those guys out there, what you have is you don't have anybody watching the land. So we talk about trespassing. Trespassing isn't just you illegally walking into somebody's land. I don't consider that trespassing. What I consider trespassing is somebody that comes onto a particular property with no regard to the property, meaning they may be riding a souped up motorcycle or a motorcycle when there should absolutely not be a rubber tire meeting that surface for whatever, environmentally for whatever reason, okay? They come in with the idea that they're gonna pick up rocks to build a fireplace or to build a patio because the desert has some beautiful rocks. So they come in with equipment or they come in with trucks and they start mining rocks illegally. They come in and they decide they want some shrubs, they want some trees, maybe they want a Joshua tree, so they decide to go out and steal a Joshua tree out of the desert, okay? All of the illegal activity that takes place that absolutely violates the land. But then we can talk about the illegal activity that doesn't violate the land. And, you know, as the immigrants came across the border, there were probably more of them saved by farmers and ranchers than were saved by the Border Patrol officers. Had those ranchers not been there and made sure those folks had something to drink or something to eat, in many cases, there would have been a lot more folks that would have lost their lives, okay? Even though the ranchers may not have liked it, I don't know any of them that wouldn't give water or feed to somebody. You know, they may disagree with them coming, but they're not gonna let anybody die. So there was a lot of lives, actual lives saved by folks that were grazing on public or private lands, okay? We don't think of those things when we want to go in and we want to remove that particular activity off of there. You know, sometimes we just think, well, cattle's got to be a problem, so we got to get them out of here. And we don't look at the benefits and the non-benefits, okay? Now, you know, what are some of the bad things that happen when we graze? You know, we deal with a human element. So not every rancher or not every ranch is going to be owned by a rancher that cares maybe as much as you or maybe as much as I do or maybe as much as society does about the land. So they're going to abuse the land as well. Okay? Those things have to be watched. And how do we police that? And I think that was one of the things that became a real big issue and why we removed so many ranchers off the land is the people that had the job of policing it didn't know how to police it properly. Didn't have the right tools perhaps, I don't know. But it became easier to remove the problem than to work with the problem. And so I think that was a big reason why we lost so many ranches, okay? But trust, sure.
So if you look at the history of it, so what we're doing behind the scenes here, guys, in case what I'm doing is I have a very cheesy presentation of this, and I'm adjusting it because Earl knows what's really going on. So will it be true to say that the bottom part of this presentation talks about overgrazing as it was prolific in the old days?
Sure.
Dust Bowl, and then a significant change being the tailored grazing act.
That was 3, yes.
And now, since then, we still have some of those problems.
We can have those problems. Anytime we have a human element, we're going to have problems. You know, simply because someone's put in a position, I don't care. We see that in whatever we have. We have good teachers, we have bad teachers, we have good farmers, we have bad farmers, we have good cops, bad cops. We always have that to deal with, okay? But simply because we have somebody not doing something wrong, we don't do away with the industry, all right? So we have to figure out how we're gonna remove that farmer or that rancher when they're doing things not properly. How do we get them out of there and not penalize everybody else with a million regulations, okay? Because our first thought is we regulate. Every time we regulate, we increase the cost of the product that we're doing. And so how do we go about removing the bad rancher or farmer without regulating the good guy so much that the product becomes unaffordable, okay? Those are all things that you guys are gonna have to talk about. In my opinion, you guys are gonna be in another level than we've been in. We already know, we think we were talking about this earlier, that we assume that most of the authorities today believe that grazing needs to take place. That's the wrong answer. That we're still having to show and keep throwing these scientific reports back in their faces saying, no, grazing is very important and it's done properly, okay? Very important for a number of reasons, and these are the reasons why. And economics is part of it. Environmental is a huge, probably the biggest part of it is environmentally that we need to do it. And then we end up with a product that people can use. We end up with cleaner water, So in that process of doing all of that, it's going to be interesting to see where this is going to end up in the next 20 or 30 years. What's going to happen? Are we going to go back in, or are we going to put grazing where we've taken grazing out of? That's going to be interesting to see if those things happen. Yes. No, I'm not saying we do anything. What I'm saying is that's going to be your job in your generation to come up with that. What we've done in the past is we keep creating regulations. What we've done is we had, let's just take the transportation industry for an example. What we did is we had some truckers that were using a lot of old, outdated equipment, okay? So we passed a Clean Air Act that regulated the trucking industry completely different. So today, the trucking industry, when you buy that goods, instead of it being 2% of the cost, it now may be 4 or 5% of the cost, okay? So was that the right thing to do? Maybe not. Maybe not creating all those regulations was the right thing to do, because it made your good operators, it cost them a lot of money to comply with the regulations, only to knock out 4 or 5 or 10% of the bad operators, okay? So is it important that every time we see something not going on right in society, do we try to regulate it, or do we try to come up with something else with the existing rules we have to take that person out with, okay? We have ranchers that may or may not be doing something right. So does that mean we want to go put stiffer regulations on the ranchers that are doing everything right? Probably not, okay? Because it's just going to cause, when you have regulations, then I have to prove that I follow those regulations. So now that means I have to employ somebody to make sure that all of those forms and everything is filled out properly and everything is done properly. So all I'm saying is those are things that you guys are going to get to think about in your generation. My generation was, we'll just pass more regulations. We'll just add another tax. We'll just do this. We'll just do that. And that's probably not the right thing to do. Something as simple as having beef growing on a rangeland, okay, without it going to a feedlot, without using any GMOs, without using any of all the mechanics that we use, costs more than if we use all of that stuff, okay? Now, isn't that crazy? Now, part of that is because of the regulations we have to go through, okay? Part of that is because of the regulations, all right? And so if I can make it like an assembly line, because corporate, bankers, and everybody looks at assembly lines, okay? So it's going to be your generation that's going to sit back and say, a bank does not have to look at an assembly line before they can loan money into a process. The way I ranch, there's no bank that would ever loan me money, okay? There's nobody that would encourage the growth of my operation. I have to do it with all my own capital, okay? So today you can't go, there's everything is set up to do it the wrong way, And the government or the bankers or the insurance companies or nobody works for doing things the right way. All right? Which is kind of crazy. So when you're in this industry and you look at this and say, I want to be green. Just to give you an idea, I would like to do farm tours. Okay? So the county says, well, you have to have a permit to do these farm tours. So right away, the first thing, it's got to be ADA. Okay, we got to figure out how we're going to do it ADA. I certainly don't want anybody to be deprived. But by the time I comply with ADA and I comply with if we're going to serve a hamburger out there, if we're going to give somebody something to eat, by the time I put up with the food handling and all the rest of the stuff that we have to do today, we don't do farm tours. Okay? So I can't charge enough to make that part of a profit center to create money for the farm, although it would be a very good learning thing. It might even draw some tourists in from out of the community that would bring money to our community. It might do a lot of things, but we can't do it because we're so regulated, okay? So those are things that we have to think about when we think about doing these things. We're kind of in a crazy time. You guys have got a lot to fix in your generation. A lot to fix, Well, I think that, and it's not that we messed up. We didn't have the information. You guys, this is ironic. I get to come to speak to folks that are getting an education. I never got an education. Why didn't I get an education? Because I'm dyslexic. I try to spell cat with a K, okay? I probably read at less than a third grade level. I probably spell at about a first or second grade level, okay? The chances of me getting an education were slim to none in my day. When my daughter went through law school and I would try to study with her, I realized that today there's enough tools that I could have made it through law school, okay? When I wanted to learn something, when I was a young man, I would come down here and I would find a student that could read well. And when I needed to read a book about something, I would bring him the book and pay him to read it and put it on cassette tape so I could then read my book that I wanted to learn, okay? But I could not get through college at that time. You had to pass an entry-level reading and spelling. And if you couldn't do it, you weren't going to be accepted. It was real simple, not even to junior college unless it was a tech part of the college, okay? So today there is so much more information and we allow people to do things that weren't allowed to do them before because the proper tools are in place for folks to do it. And we understand that just because a person reads at a third level, they still are able to go out and support themselves and still be able to go do things. And in my time, they were thinking, how are we going to sign this guy up for welfare, for Christ's sakes, if we can just get him a job somewhere where he's sweeping the floor, that'll be great, And so, a lot of things have changed. And so, did we make a lot of mistakes? Yes, but they were made out of ignorance. They weren't made because we were being mean or vicious. And I think it's hard for you guys to understand that my grandparents, when they got married in a wagon, in a buggy, and a horse hauled them from their wedding, okay? My grandparents would have been your great-great-grandparents, okay? My grandparents did that. So, when you look at it that way, and they got to see a man on the moon, and I can still remember when they bought their first transistor radio, and they sit there and couldn't understand how that noise came out of that little itty-bitty transistor radio, okay? So, the information that you folks are born with are 100 times more than a generation behind you. And with that comes a lot more responsibility. And I think you guys are, as I see the young population, I think you're doing a good job with it as a whole, Yes.
Would you say that so companies that stop manufacturing, there's some farmers that choose to ignore the regulations, pay the fine?
There really isn't no way to ignore regulations today. There really isn't no way to ignore them. And you know what? There's a reason typically why every regulation's in place, okay? But it costs money to do those, all right? So we'll take something as simple as the AMDA, okay? How do we decide where that should be applied and where it shouldn't be applied? Who would want to be that judge?
The Animal Protection Act.
No, the Americans Disabled Act.
Oh, okay.
So if you're doing a ranch and even as an employer, you know, you want to have a 2-story barn, and you're in violation if a person in a wheelchair can't get to that 2nd story. Okay? Okay? So how do we make all of these things happen? So there's guys that have been in the farming industry for years, and maybe they do a recreational deal on the side to help support the farming part of it, because oftentimes with most farms, there's a certain amount of recreation that comes with it. Okay? People would enjoy coming and working a week at the farm or the ranch or something like that, okay? A day, a weekend or something. You can't do that unless you meet all of the ADMA, the Americans Disabled Act, all right? Now, who wants to say that somebody in a wheelchair can't come? I don't want to be that person, you know? I mean, but by the grace of God, there I may go. You know what I mean? So that's the last thing I want to do, but how do we do those things? And is that something that each entity has to pay for as we become more of a social government? Is that something the government pays for? I don't know. You know, those are going to be you guys' decisions. It's going to be interesting to see how all of those things are going to match.
Like Grazing, on the trip, we're going to stop at Hinkley Dairy. And we're talking about how locally, very, very all over the country, very would call it, right? But the way it's coming down at the very moment in Hinkley, and having for those dairies out there, that they're going to impose on them a whole bunch of restrictions and monitoring to prove that they're not polluting the water with nitrate. What we're saying as the Resource Conservation District, trying to make sense out of all this, is yes, the policy's good, but it's how you implement it. And we're saying, back off on all that monitoring and drilling a well and taking samples, hiring an engineer, and let's focus on giving the ranchers the right best management practice. One of this is you're going to see at Hinkley Dairy, they separate out the pure from the urine dairy water that comes from there, and that gets put back out on the land. That's the best management practice. Their nitrates are actually going down, not up. But if you focus the farmer on all the regulations and monitoring and report on this and write an accountability report on that, they don't have time or money to do the things that they know they need to do, right? So that's the thing. And now those farmers are those dairymen are in jeopardy of just giving up and economically just stopping. So that's a discussion we're going to have on the trip. That's a local example of how this it's not so much the policy, but it's how the policy is enforced. Everybody agrees, like Earl just said, that having clean drinking water is a good thing. But are we going to shut down a big part of our local economy because we're not going to allow this process to happen and support best management instead of regulation? Does that make sense? Try to get to that.
And part of the problem that we have today is the person that's in charge of something doesn't understand what they're in charge of. Is what I oftentimes find out. Okay? And I'll give you a case in point at the Lost Forest Ranch. I had been operating that ranch for 10 years. The 10 years I was there, every year, the end results, and we have monitoring wells there where we monitor the water weekly. Every week that water is tested to see if what we're doing is right or wrong. See what the nitrates in the water are when they leave. We monitor the groundwater that leaves for chloroforms and bacteria and any other thing that might be in the water. We monitor it when it comes onto us from the different creeks that flow into us, okay? And so Lahontan, we work with two water agencies. We work with Mojave Water Agency that monitors the groundwater. We work with Lahontan that manages the water that's underground, that seeps under the ground and before it leaves the ranch. So Lahontan is a state agency, and their job is to make sure that there's nobody putting pollutants into the water. So over a 10-year period each year, I have my nitrates continue to drop. And the reason we monitor that water is that is the affluent water that comes in from the city of Crestline, very heavy in nitrates, and we want to make sure that those nitrates, when they hit our groundwater, are at a particular safe level, okay? So over the next 10 years, they drop. I start getting calls from the water district saying, whatever you're doing wrong down there, you better quit doing it because they're investigating you. And I go, well, what could I be doing wrong? You know? Now we have about a section of land that water is to be contained on until it goes underground. And on that ranch, we reuse our water up to 4 times, in some cases 4 times. Almost all of it gets used twice. The way that we send it out across by using the irrigation system that the Spaniards had actually perfected back in the 1700s. We brought that irrigation system back in when I took over and started reusing that irrigation system. And it requires only gravity. The Spaniards were geniuses already by then. They understood engineering, they understood all of it, and they brought a lot to our country, and that's one of the gifts we had was their irrigation system. And so we use that irrigation system by spreading that water across about a section of land. Now once it goes underground and we bring it back up, then it is no longer considered affluent water. It may not be a lot cleaner, but it'll be some cleaner. But by the time it does that 3 times and it leaves the ranch, it's absolutely much cleaner. So they kept thinking that I was taking the water and moving the water to a different portion of the ranch where there were no test wells, okay? And that I was using other water to irrigate with. So they kept thinking that I was doing something wrong. So eventually, Lahontan sends 4 of their people down. All 4 of them have a doctorate degree in something. It certainly was not plant life, okay? It certainly was not ranching. It certainly was not, it had to do with clean water. They came down. Every one of them were at least my age, if not maybe a little older. And we met, and they wanted to look at how we did our irrigation. I showed them, and then they asked me, they said, well, where's your pump? And we want to see where your pump and all your equipment that you have to maintain this property. I said, well, we don't use equipment. The only pieces of equipment we use is I have a small backhoe that I use to maintain these ditches that we do during the dry season. If we've had a blowout or we have a spot that's looking bad, we go in and we make those repairs. And we have a small tractor that we use out in the front of the property alongside the road that we brush hog down. We use a mower and mow down along the roadside just so if somebody flips a cigarette out or something, the fire doesn't come onto the ranch. Those are the only pieces of equipment that we use. And he said, well, and I said, we don't keep them here. We use them so seldom that we don't keep anything here. I want to see your pump. We don't have a pump. So anyway, he said, can we talk to your employee? So I have one part-time guy that works for me, and he actually lives on the ranch, and he happened to be there that day. So I called him and I said, Mark, I got some gentlemen here that would like to talk to you. So he came over, and they took him off, and they were questioning him, and he's telling them the same thing about the tractors, and we don't keep them here, and they wanted to know where our fuel station was. We don't fuel them here. Usually we just work them a couple hours and then they're gone. And he said, well, I want to know about your pump. He said, oh, the pump's down by our catch pins. And I didn't realize that he had told them that. I just seen them get in the car and off they took off down by where the catch pin's about 3 miles away. Well, what I had down there was I had a little, what we call a 2-inch trash pump that I had by one of the places that catches the water, and it's about 50 yards from the catch pins. So if I wanted to fill some watering troughs while I had my cattle in there, because I'd keep them overnight on occasion, we could just start up that little pump and I could pump that water. That's on a completely opposite side of the ranch, and that water's already been through the ground 2 or 3 times by then. And that particular part of the ranch does not get any of the affluent water. So anyway, he took them down there and he showed them that little pump, and they got rather frustrated. So they came back thinking, you know, that they'd had a dirty trick played on them. And I tried to explain to them that, no, Mark didn't understand what you were talking about, you know. And I knew you didn't care to see that pump. That's why I didn't tell you about that pump. And that's the only pump we have. And so they said to me, you got to explain why your nitrates are going down. And I said, it's very simple. If you'll take a walk with me out through my pasture, the difference in this pasture today than 10 years ago when I took this ranch over that had been abused very much, because the grass grows, the grass takes the nitrates out of the ground. And as you remove the nitrates, the ground is like a filter with nitrates. So if you're running too many nitrates and the nitrates have pretty much in the ground as much as they can be, the nitrates just pass over it and they don't get collected into the ground. So as you utilize those nitrates and the ground's able to accept more nitrates, you're able to use up more nitrates. So the healthier the grass, the more nitrates you're going to use, because that's what we use to grow grass is nitrates, okay? So how we get nitrates out of the water? Through grass, through plant life. It's real simple. It doesn't take a factory, it doesn't take anything. It's why in wetlands, they're so important, because you're taking nitrates out of that water as that water is used in those wetlands. Fields, pastures, all those things remove nitrates, okay? So they absolutely had to go do their own research to understand that. Now there's 4 very highly educated men that didn't understand the simple fact that grass utilized nitrates, okay? And they had made it that far in their careers.
Okay, I'm going to test these guys. So the grass uses the nitrates, but if something else didn't happen, those nitrates, when the grass dies or sits there, would go back into the ground, right? And it would be the same problem. Where do those nitrates actually go? And then what? What happens to those nitrates when they get grazed by the cow? Do they poop all out? Yeah, but how? This is basic chemistry here, guys. Biochemistry.
Not
Producing meat or dairy, yes.
no.
They get turned into protein.
Protein.
What are we eating?
Nitrates are the first beginning of protein.
Nitrogen is what goes to make protein. But the food that we take off that, either a dairy product or the meat, is taking those nitrates that man made in the first place, right? People in Crestline could feed that to the water supply. We did it, right? Cattle are taking it out of the system and then we take it. So what are we doing with people in the sustainable environmental science class? We're replicating the natural cycle of nitrogen, correct? What we want to do as a society is we just want to send it down the stream here to Victor Valley Wastewater Treatment Plant or to Earl's Ranch, and we hope it just magically disappears. And then we want to say, no, don't use it on the grass, don't feed cattle with it. Well, what we're doing is polluting ourselves, because it's just going to continue to accumulate unless we follow the natural cycle. That's exactly what nature does if there were a bunch of wild animals.
You have to understand that before white man was here, there were herds of antelope, deer, and elk were running prevalent here, okay? We can't have that today because we like our freeways and we want to get to San Bernardino and we want to get down to the mall and we want to get over here and by all means, we got to get to lunch here pretty soon, okay? So we don't want to, so we won't put up with that. So we have the best thing we can do is bring the proper species in to graze what needs to be grazed. So we had browsers and we had grazers prior to us coming, okay? So we have to continue to do that if we want to have healthy plant life. We can't leave it up to the rainforest to create all the oxygen and pure all the water for us in the world. We have to take some of that responsibility on. You know, everybody says, well, I don't want to see cattle, I don't want to see this, I don't want to see that. Well, it's all part of the circle of life if we want to have life. And it's part of the reason that we are meat eaters, along with eating fruits and vegetables, is because we needed to be able to harvest that protein in order to keep the proper amount of animals grazing somewhere. So it goes way back, before we got the idea of turning cows out. That had already been thought out for us, you know. So it's pretty unique when you look at it. And even though we have screwed up a lot of things on this planet, the one thing we haven't screwed up is the circle of life. And that's really important. If you as a young person, you start thinking about it, and you learn how to embrace every one of the seasons that come along and the reason for those seasons. It's really pretty cool. And then you take that and you apply that to farming and ranching. Okay? It's what we have to do. Now, if we don't want to do that, then we got to build hothouses. We got to start using all kinds of commercial fertilizer. We got to do, we start developing GMOs, and we start doing those things. And there's nothing wrong with that, because if we're going to feed the masses, we're going to continue to do that for probably a few hundred years yet. Okay? And we're going to learn how to be better at it. But we're going to continue to do that. The other thing, that each one of you are what we call customers. Okay? And customers dictate what farmers grow. When you guys enjoy buying a $5 pizza, you're not buying any of my grass-fed beef. Okay? When you buy a $1 hamburger somewhere, you're not buying any of our grass-fed beef. Okay? So when you do those things and you go, I'm pissed at the big corporations that do this, well, but you're the ones feeding them. You, the public, are the ones feeding them. Okay? It's amazing how many folks I know will buy our beef, and I ask them a question. I said, now, they're a soccer mom, and I say, now when you got the minivan full of kids and you're leaving the soccer tournament, it's your turn to buy food, where do you go? Do you go to Whole Foods and buy something to take home? Oh God, no. The $5 pizza comes into play, okay? So nobody lives their life 100% properly, but it's something that we think about. The thing of it is about farming is this: everyone is going to have an occupation at some